Okay, so I'll say it again as if it's just arrived. So, welcome, hello everybody. So, so we're continuing. I realised last time that I finished Matthew 21. I finished on verse 40. I think I finished. Hang on, is it? Yeah, no, sorry. That even what it says there is incorrect. I finished on verse 45, and there is actually a verse 46, which probably we should have done last time. So I will use the fact that I forgot to do Matthew 21, verse 46 last time, to kind of introduce and put what the passage of the parable we're going to look at today in a little bit more context. So you remember there's been toing and froing in the temple, Sadducees coming, the scribes coming, the Pharisees coming, and they've been kind of throwing challenges at Jesus. They've been trying to contain him because in the previous days Jesus has really owned the temple, with the riding in on the donkey and turning over the money tables and so on. So the bringing the argument to Jesus and looking to discredit him, and Jesus has been answering all of those sorts of things. And then we read in that context, but they were seeking to lay hold of him, but they feared the crowds because they considered him to be a prophet. And the immediate context there is the Pharisees have come. But what's really interesting when the Pharisees have come is that the scribe who speaks on their behalf actually ends up recognizing and endorsing Jesus's response. And you get that impression as you. Well, it's more than just an impression. The Gospels actually spell it out. And we often think of the Pharisees as the enemy, but very often in the Gospels they're shown as a mixed situation. And that's probably because in the early church, which Matthew's being written for, huge numbers of the early church are coming from the Pharisaic tradition. The Pharisees took scripture more seriously. It's just that they had a range of different ways of interpreting and a range of different schools and so on. And so within that context, there were some within that tradition that are responding well to Jesus. But then those who have authority and control, as we'll understand, are part of the Jewish leadership that for whom Jesus is a threat. So this is the kind of context. They would love to do something, but because the crowds consider him to be a prophet, they have to be careful. And then we go on into chapter 22. And so in answering, so Jesus has been answering all day. People have been coming, challenging. In answering, Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, and I take that in many ways to say there's there is probably a broader kind of a context as Jesus is addressing the people, and that people has a lot of people who support him, because we've just read it here, because they consider him to be a prophet. Even amongst the Pharisees, there are those who consider Jesus to be a good teacher. We've just had that level of endorsement. And now Matthew kind of presents, and there's probably a sense in which this particular parable, well, as we're going to see, Jesus he modifies or adapts a parable that he's already told. And so in many ways, this parable is being used to illustrate some of the broader conversation that Jesus has with the crowds around him. And as we're going to kind of draw out, there's a sense in which it plays a double role in the context that it appears in Matthew, compared to when we read it just a little while earlier in Jesus's kind of flow of events in the Gospel of Luke, although we've not looked at that, obviously, in the in our running through with the light lunch study, but we'll think about that as we go. So Jesus is going to so the parable in one sense is probably one that is being reused, and that's an important just kind of consideration, understanding. Sometimes we kind of get that sense in Matthew, a parable sits here, Luke, it sits there, but they're not necessarily being presented purely in the context of order, because probably Jesus reused certain parables and illustrations, probably giving them slightly different emphases in different places. Because he doesn't have a crowd of unique people who come and hear in him every place. So it makes sense to kind of reuse good parables and illustrations. So there's an element of that as we kind of read through Matthew's Gospel. And it's worth considering, as I said, because within this context, we kind of see a little bit of an emphasis that fits both with Matthew's wider agenda for the Jerusalem church, the early Jerusalem church, and also something to do with the situation as it's developing. So the kingdom of the heavens has become like a man. I noticed this when I was just preparing the slides just earlier today. The kingdom of heavens has become like is the kind of literal grammatic format of the words, and I can't tell you whether that's true, whether that's just a general thing, or whether I noticed it here, because as I said, what I was just trying to draw out to you, we're heading towards a key moment, and there's a kind of in the teaching that we find, particularly in Matthew's gospel, we see we're coming to a crux position, which is going to mean, if you like, the end of the temple system and the birth of the church. And Matthew's gospel, which is being written as the foundational gospel, is being written directly into a context of people who have lived through this transition and have lived through some of the conflict. They've not yet had Jerusalem destroyed. That comes in a bit, but it's all very much a part of this early church agenda of what's going on. And so here, I just thought it was interesting that the kind of the grammatical form is the kingdom of heavens has become like a man, a king who made a wedding feast. And as I say, whether I should do this or not, I'm not sure, because I haven't had a chance to look at lots of the other parables to see whether that's just common in all of them. We normally translate it as the kingdom of heaven is like a man who made a wedding feast. But I like the idea of it becoming, because there's a kind of a moment happening that is giving this parable, which as Jesus has told before, it's giving it a more kind of tense flavour than it occurs in Luke's gospel. So he tells the parable. So he sent out his servants to call invitees to the wedding feast, but they wouldn't come. And again, he sent other servants saying, tell those invitees, look, I prepared my dinner, my oxen and the fatlings have been roasted. I've actually translated roasted. A lot of translations have killed, but it's sacrificed, and actually involves the idea of cooking and roasting. So I think roasted is not a bad word. So they've been roasted, so it's already prepared and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. That's the invite that goes out. But they made light of it. Now, it's at the moment, it's very much in step with the parable that Jesus tells in Luke's gospel. In Luke's gospel, someone's throwing a big feast, a big meal, and there nobody gets violent, because this is, as I say, this is part of the contrast. There's something of this parable that is becoming more intense. So from a few weeks ago, when Jesus told it on the road down towards Jerusalem in Luke's gospel, then someone's throwing a feast and people just go off and do other things and don't really bother. So that's how it starts. They're making light of it. They went off, one to his own farm, another goes to his merchandise, i.e. the stuff he's got to make money with. But then we get this extra little layer. But the rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. And again, with the benefits of hindsight, because we know how the story ends, and we know that we're only a few days away from these events that where Jesus himself is going to be killed, and that there's something about how this parable is coming into contrast. So the king was enraged. Once he had sent his troops, he destroyed those murderers and burned their town. So as I say, this is a much more extreme step than we had in Luke's gospel. And the teaching kind of a moment that the parable gives Jesus in Luke's gospel is that all those who originally were invited end up not enjoying the feast. And in that contrast, it's those who are pressing into the kingdom faster, the prostitutes, the sinners, the tax collectors, and so on, who are getting in ahead of those who are more religious. And so that's the kind of the flow and the flavour of it. Whereas now it's getting a little bit more extreme, because there are some who aren't just indifferent, but they actually end up in their anger at even being invited in and the opportunity being given to them that they don't want. So they end up persecuting the servants, mistreating them and killing them. And as a response now, there is a destruction that happens. So he destroys those murderers and burned their towns. And as I say, we can see now with hindsight, because actually this is an agenda that has been coming in to the story of Jesus' last week right the way through. Remember, as Jesus comes in, he looks at Jerusalem and he weeps for it, because there's something early on in the week. He weeps over the city as he comes into the city. He's going to tell the parable in the next chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Not the parable. He's going to give the apocalyptic sermon, which actually draws into it far more concrete elements of the destruction that's coming. But we get it right the way through Jesus's last week, if you like, the impending disaster for the city and Jesus's grief over it, but which in one sense is very much a response to something that is going on. So the kingdom of heaven is now becoming like this. It's really becoming a dividing point. And that kind of tension is actually, I think, a common one right the way through church history, that there are huge numbers of circumstances where the gospel is really good news for everybody, but there come to be certain kind of key moments where the gospel is like a sword. It does bring a sword, divides one person from the other. It's one of those kind of common things that anyone who is involved in ministry with really broken people will suddenly discover that there are some of those broken people who end up resenting the fact that somebody else has somehow come through what they can't. And then it gets a bit more aggressive and a bit more violent, because somehow it plays into a sense of injustice, and misread very often, but that's often the way it goes. And so suddenly it's not so much of a blessing, but it becomes a point of anger and conflict. And Jesus anticipates it coming. He can see it coming. So the king, in the parable, he tells the story. The king was enraged, sent his troops, he destroyed those murderers and burned their towns. And then he said, and now this is where it goes on, you see, from Luke's telling, it kind of transitions and starts to look forward. So there is a kind of a sense in the way Matthew's telling the story. It comes at a moment where there's all this toing and froing, and Jesus continuing to talk to the crowds and the people, and Jesus revisits a parable he's used before, which was seen in a very kind of positive way by the crowds that listen to Jesus, who consider him to be a prophet, because, as you said, the emphasis was you're getting into the kingdom ahead of them. You're moving into that place before some of those who look like they ought to be, or tell you at least that they should be in the kingdom ahead of you. But now there's something actually where there's some quite bad consequences for those who seem to be good people. They sit in all of the right positions, but there's some sense of judgment coming for them because of the conflict that's coming. And now Jesus turns the emphasis to this wider group of people who weren't seem to be part of the initial invitation. And of course, as we think about it, it becomes this kind of key moment that is there in the days of the early church as they deal with the increasing mission that they have outside of Israel, with all of its cultural implications and so on. So some of these things which are beginning to already happen in the time when Matthew's compiling his gospel will become even more so by the time we get to John and Luke's gospels, as we work through the book of Acts. But actually those who are being invited in who weren't part of the original invitation list. So he said to his servants, "In truth, the wedding banquet is ready, but the invitees are not deserving. So go into the street intersections and invite as many as you can find to the wedding feast." And so suddenly what we're discovering is that the invite is to everybody. And the servants went out into the streets and they gathered everyone they could find, both bad and good. And you see, you're getting a real moment, which is in this transitional moment within the gospel. That actually there is the grace that is embodied in the gospel is not for you because you're good and you've got an option to do with it what you like. It's there for both the bad and the good. It's now about getting people in. It's now for people from cultures where they don't have good practices around marriage and and child rearing, or how they do their finances, or how they treat their servants or slaves. They're coming from all sorts of messy backgrounds now, and so now the wedding was filled with guests. So the people who were originally invited didn't deserve it; they lost it. Those who didn't deserve it are now being invited, and now initially they're all coming in. But then we get this little kind of warning, this kind of second layer, because within this context, so they're all coming in, But then the king came in to see the reclining guests, and he saw a man not dressed in wedding clothes. And we'll finish the verses, but the tension that is captured at the end here is one which we're going to see kind of playing itself out through the rest of the New Testament, or certainly the history parts of the New Testament and in Paul's letters. But equally is something that we know and is a regular conversation in churches where there's real life, which is the issue of we come in, not the bad come in. They don't come in because they're good, but now how do things relate? How do things grow? How does their behaviour change? So the king here, in the way Jesus presents the story, the king comes in, sees the reclining guests, and he saw a man not dressed in wedding clothes. And so he said to him, "Friend, how did you come here without a wedding garment?" And the thing with him being silent, the Greek word's kind of it's muzzle, but it's not a kind of it's a kind of well, I don't need, it's almost I don't have an answer, so I'm not going to bother with an answer. That's the way I kind of see it. So actually this phrase, "Friend, how come you come here without a wedding garment?" could have a positive response. This is the best I've got. But he doesn't say that. He's just, well, whatever. This is who I am. I am who I am. And so the king then told the servants, "So tie him hand and foot, take him away and throw him outside into the darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth." It's interesting if you go and look at various commentaries on this. But Jesus tells a number of parables where people are left in the outer darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And we're very quick with hindsight to want to make this kind of to get thrown into hell, which isn't actually the point of the parable here. And actually would kind of actually break lots of people's theological assumptions if he was once in, then after he was in the kingdom, he then got thrown out of the kingdom, because of the way they think about those things. So I just think it's not part of the context; it's part of the storytelling, rather than the kind of a deep theological statement. But what Jesus is driving at is perhaps captured in the tension we see in the letters, say from James. And Paul talks about a letter came from James and it disturbed some people, because we're trying to wrestle as an early church with this context of the grace that God is giving people, so they don't have to come in via the law, but actually, what is it that the law captured, which is still appropriate for them to dress themselves in now that they have come in. And it's not that they're achieving their salvation by their works, but as James kind of puts it, well, you can see Abraham's faith by the things he does. The two are very much tied up. And if you want to look at it generously, you can kind of see almost the flow of those who are believing in Jesus within their Jewish heritage. And those who are coming into an experience of the grace that once belonged to God's chosen people in Israel as Gentiles, that benefit for them is coming because of an experience of something that Jesus is going to accomplish for them. So they've come in without the need to be of a quality that would normally have got them noticed by the kind of friend that's in place here. The nobleman wouldn't normally have noticed them, but somehow they've come in based on the grace that is available in the sacrifice of Jesus. But actually, their acceptance has to be of a kind of a quality that actually therefore takes on board and recognizes something of the significance of the feast that they're taking part in. So I'm probably not saying it very clearly, but it's this kind of this tension of do you try and behave well, and you don't realize it, that you haven't come into the kingdom because you deserved it. You've come in because you got invited from grace. And actually it seems quite easy for you because you've come from a place where you were trying to do it in the flesh. You don't have it. The pressure has been lifted off you. You don't have to do it in the flesh anymore. But actually your instincts have been so shaped by trying to do it that it looks quite, your moral behaviour looks like it ought to look like quite easily. Whereas if you come from a very different kind of context, it's the other way around. Well, You haven't had any real experience in that, but are you at least making an effort? So anyway, as I say, hopefully you're all smart enough to kind of get that tension that I'm trying to drive at. Is we kind of come in, our roots into the grace that God has made available to us is different from different sides. And I think that in the way that Matthew tells the story, there is a moment here that is anticipating the Gentiles coming in. It's not explicit, but here it is that they weren't deserving. They're coming in. There's going to be tension. And actually, when Matthew has drawn this story, which has been part of Jesus' back catalogue of parables, if you like, he adds this layer which kind of flags the fact that there is a change. But it's not necessarily what got them invited in or not. And there is something that, as James kind of throws it in his letter, that real faith is not just mental; it actually affects behaviour as well. So I'll show you Abraham's faith by his actions, by his works, and that kind of tension is there, and it's. Even as I'm waffling about it right now, we recognise we're not always good at putting our finger exactly on what's appropriate and what isn't, because we don't want to sound like we're saying you got saved by works, but we're still saying, but there's a sense in which if you really understood it, then it ought to have affected who you are. Because as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. If you really took it on board, it ought to have produced something transformative in you. And so I think Matthew kind of his extra additions within this parable kind of bring out a couple of things. One, it's more intense than just that people are missing the opportunity, because actually the intensity of how they're reacting, not just to ignore it, but to be violent and aggressive, and actually Jesus is going to die as a result of it. That's highlighting something in those that don't want the good news. It's making a way for others who didn't ask for it, but now they're benefiting from it. But that benefit, that grace, doesn't mean to say that there's no transformation. There's no, and actually there will be those that do need it. We should expect to see fruits in keeping with the repentance. You see, we should expect to see that, which is kind of then captured in the final verse, which is so well known. For many are called, but few are choice or chosen, which is the last verse we'll be looking at today. In fact, I've just realised 14. I think at the beginning, I'd said we were going from. I think my first slide, I had the wrong verse at the beginning and the wrong verse at the end, because I put 13 on the bottom as well, haven't I? Just looking at we're going up to 22:13. We're not. We're going up to 22:14, and even worse. Sorry, I've just seen it. Actually, the number next to the verse, it says 11, doesn't even say 14. So you have to forgive me for corrupting the word of God so badly. This should be Matthew 22 verse 14. Many are called, but few are choice or chosen. Few exhibit or express that calledness. So here we have the bit which we've already had some understanding from Jesus which is not all who called Israel really are Israel, i.e. they're not all in that place where they're really engaging with the Lord. So those people aren't, and some of those who come in and can play the card of, well, it's all about grace, but actually there's not any of the fruit in keeping with that acceptance of the things, and some of those actually probably aren't. So there is, I'm just trying to find the right word for it, there is an almost unhelpful, and I'm cautious when I say that because obviously Jesus said it and Matthew recorded it, so but I think therefore a deliberately unhelpful focus here on what is excluding you. That it's easy to recognise why certain people are being excluded, but we don't want to err the other way as well, which is to recognise, is to kind of, which actually I hear a lot of. You see, and it's very often difficult to kind of argue against, because people say, oh, it's all grace, it's all about love. So how can you say you've got to accept that this person's faith is real, and so on. Say, yes, you know what, I'm not going to be judgmental, because I take Paul very seriously when he says, It's not for you to say who goes up and who goes down, etc., etc. But we are supposed to kind of have that sense of discernment, and actually we should bring some reverence into the conversation and discussion, and there should be some level of change or transformation. There should be some sort of sense that someone has made some level of effort for the wedding feast. Just as a kind of a very personal illustration of this recently, a few weeks ago, I went to a friend's wedding. He's an older person. He'd gone through, unfortunately, sadly, the previous marriage had broken down. And after all of the breakdowns of the previous marriage, he'd been contacted out of the blue by the girl he used to go out with when he was at university, who's also, her marriage had gone down. They remarried. So I was invited, but almost everybody else in the invite, there was only a handful of English people born in the UK, because he himself was Mexican, his wife was Mexican, but they were getting married in the UK. Sorry, there's a point to this story. So I got my best suit. I've only got one now because I haven't had a huge need to wear these things for a long time, and I had to squeeze into it because I've obviously put on some weight over COVID and all of those sorts of things. So I squeezed into my best suit, went there feeling very smug, and felt totally scruffy the whole time, because every one of these Mexican guys were all wearing dinner jackets, full bow tie and everything else. So, and they were all of them, and all of the women were in kind of ball gowns, and I was in my rather ill-fitting Marks and Spencer's suit. So anyway, I'm just kind of making the point. I made an effort within my context. It may not have been my instinct to look quite as good and as dapper as most of the other wedding guests, but I was, at least there was something in me that recognised the moment and was trying to honour the moment. And you're just hearing my insecurities in it. Nobody was rude to me or anything about it, but that seems to that's the positive side we draw from it. Okay, I want to get this right. It is by grace that we've come in, but equally that grace expects something of me, and he also gives me the ability, the way Paul puts it in Romans, isn't it? If you're he set something before us, word predestined. Always awkward when we use that word because people think it means something it doesn't. he set a goal ahead of us. He predestined us, and then he called us. That's the next layer. But then he what's the word he uses? He goes on and talks about glorifying. There is a kind of a sense in which all of it is by grace. He's done these things, done these things, done these things. But I have to access each element by that kind of grace. But there should be some level of change within who I am. So I probably said the same thing about 15 times now. So let's take it. That's the final verse. The many are called, but few are choice, which is both an encouragement to us, because actually the invite now has gone broadly, and anyone that you can find on the road is now invited in. But as they come in, actually it should produce some sort of fruit in keeping with repentance. Real repentance, real acceptance of the invitation actually should involve some level of transforming instinct in us, because that glorification goes on, and the Lord's provided the power for that to happen. So those are my takes on the verses. Trying to recognise where it sits within Matthew's gospel, where it sits within the life of Jesus, as Matthew is writing for a church that's wrestling with these issues, with Gentiles coming in, and anticipating eventually the big transition out of Jerusalem into the whole world. He captures this parable that's part of Jesus' regular teaching agenda. It's been used before, but he gives it these new layers and flavours. So hopefully that made some sense. Would anyone like to comment or say anything about what we've been looking at?